The galaxy did not fear chaos. It had conquered it long ago. Across the spiral arms, from the oldest stellar nurseries to the youngest frontier systems, intelligent life had reached the same conclusion through different paths. Order was survival. Species that learned to predict their environment thrived. Species that failed to do so vanished, leaving only debris and unanswered equations. And so the great civilizations of the galaxy did not merely rule worlds, they measured them. They measured economic outputs, military response times, cultural rigidity, emotional volatility. They reduced entire species to curves and probabilities, to behavioral constants and predictable deviations. War was no longer an art, it was accounting. Diplomacy was no longer persuasion, it was timing. By the time humanity discovered faster-than-light travel, the galaxy had already decided what humanity would become, not through malice, through math. The Virelian Concord had existed longer than most stars had known stability. Its founding species, the Virelians, were not conquerors by nature. They were archivists of cause and effect. Their bodies were slender and tall, their iridescent skin shifting hues with emotional state, though centuries of discipline had rendered those shifts subtle. They believed in one sacred principle: everything that can be observed can be predicted. Their empire expanded not through brute force, but through inevitability. They did not invade worlds, they arrived, presented models, demonstrated outcomes, and waited. Civilizations resisted, as all did. Civilizations exhausted themselves, as all did. Civilizations joined, as all did. The Concord had never been wrong, not once. So when long-range probes detected an emerging FTL signature from a yellow star catalogued as Sol 3, the reaction was academic. "A new entrant," said High Emissary Sale Veor, reviewing the report. "Late development, chemical propulsion remnants, nuclear scars. Emotion-heavy signal traffic, highly fragmented governance," added analyst Keshtal. The chamber hummed softly as predictive engines awakened. Simulations bloomed into existence. Human political behavior, human military doctrine, human historical responses to existential pressure. The projections converged quickly. Keshtal tilted his head in faint surprise. "Low variance," he said. "They resemble earlier cases." Sale Veor's crest flickered with mild amusement. "Then they will follow the curve." "Designation?" asked a junior observer. Sale Veor considered for a moment. "Predictable," he said. The word was entered into the archive. Humanity's first deep space transmission was not a greeting. It was music. A chaotic mix of rhythms and voices, layered without obvious structure, accompanied by mathematical constants and images of Earth, children running, storms forming over oceans, cities glowing at night. The Concord analysts watched in silence. "Symbolic noise," one said eventually. "Emotional signaling, no strategic value." "Catalog it," Sale Veor replied. "Begin behavioral correlation." The models adjusted. Human emotional expression was erratic, but not unmanageable. In fact, it made prediction easier. Strong emotions produced strong patterns. Fear led to consolidation. Pride led to overextension. Hope led to risk. The Concord had seen it 1,000 times. So they sent no response, not yet. Instead, they watched as humanity took its first steps into nearby systems, mining asteroids inefficiently, establishing fragile colonies dependent on constant supply chains, naming ships after mythological figures instead of functional identifiers. It was endearing and temporary. When the Concorde finally arrived, they did so openly. No stealth, no deception. The Valor's grace emerged from folded space above Earth like a thought given form. Its presence disrupted satellites, bent sunlight, and cast a moving shadow across continents. Humanity noticed. Panic surged through global networks, militaries scrambled, old rivalries flared, then paused, unsure where to aim. Inside the Valor's grace, Sailveyor watched Earth rotate slowly beneath him. "So small," murmured one observer. "So loud," replied another. Sailveyor raised a hand. "Begin transmission." Every screen on Earth went dark. Then they all showed him. "People of Earth," Sailveyor said, his voice calm, measured, translated into every known language simultaneously. "Your species has reached a developmental threshold recognized by the Virelian Concorde." He allowed a pause, not for drama, but for comprehension. "You will now transition into protected status. Your expansion will be regulated, your military development restricted, your resources cataloged and taxed according to output." Riots began before he finished speaking. Sailveyor watched him dispassionately. "In return," he continued, "you will be preserved. Your extinction probability will drop below 1%. Your culture will be recorded." He inclined his head. "This is not conquest. This is continuation." The transmission ended. Sailveyor turned to his analysts. "Start the clock." The first 72 hours unfolded exactly projected. Governments argued publicly while negotiating privately. Military leaders demanded readiness while economists warned of collapse. Populations fractured into camps: resist, comply, deny. Social networks burned with outrage and fear. Keshtal monitored the data streams with professional satisfaction. "Deviation minimal," he reported. "They are performing within predicted emotional thresholds." Sailveyor nodded. "When does symbolic resistance occur?" "Within 48 hours," Keshtal replied. "Likely a limited military maneuver or exploratory vessel. Low threat." Right on schedule, a ship launched. It was not one of Earth's newest warships. It was old, painted white, scarred, designed for exploration rather than combat. The Artemis. Sailveyor observed it through magnified projection. "A museum piece," one officer remarked. "Symbolism matters to them," Keshtal said. "They will attempt to reclaim dignity." The Artemis transmitted a hail. A human female appeared on screen, her uniform worn but immaculate. "This is Commander Elena Park. We acknowledge your presence," she said. Sailveyor inclined his head politely. Acknowledgement received. "We are reviewing your demands," Park continued. Sailveyor allowed a faint smile. "You have 72 hours." Park nodded once. "Understood." The transmission ended. But the ship did not turn back. Instead, it drifted closer, closer than expected. "Commander," an officer said, "the human vessel is approaching minimum safety distance." "Are they locking weapons?" Sailveyor asked. "No," Keshtal replied. "No targeting systems active, no power spike." "Then why approach?" Keshtal hesitated. "Unknown." The word lingered in the chamber longer than it should have. The Artemis stopped just outside the Concorde's gravity envelope. It floated there, silent, observing. "Perhaps they wished to be seen," a junior observer suggested. Sailveyor studied the ship. Humans were emotional, yes, but they were also curious. Curiosity was harder to model. "Log the interaction," Sailveyor said. "Continue observation." He turned away, unconcerned. The curve had never failed. And yet, far below, on Earth, something subtle began to change. Not unity, Not obedience, something else entirely, something the models had no name for. The Concorde had a word for what came next: normalization. It was the stage where fear burned itself out, where outrage exhausted its voice, and where civilizations began to accept the shape of the future placed before them. Resistance did not end here, but it lost coherence, direction, purpose. Humanity, according to every model ever run, was entering normalization. From orbit, Earth still looked chaotic. Cities flared with unrest, markets dipped and recovered erratically. Military forces remained on high alert without clear orders. But beneath that surface noise, the Concorde saw what it expected: hesitation. No unified fleet launched, no preemptive strike occurred, no declaration of total war was issued. Instead, human ships continued to rise slowly from Earth and its orbital stations: civilian hulls, research platforms, mining barges, exploration craft long thought obsolete. They did not assemble into formation. They did not transmit ultimatums. They simply arrived. One by one, then in clusters, then in swarms too loose to classify. Inside the Veiler's Grace, analyst Kesh Tao frowned at the expanding tactical display. "They're not following a threat posture," he said, "but their traffic density is increasing." Salvator clasped his hands behind his back. "Symbolic presence," he said calmly. "They wish to feel included in the moment of their own submission." "Submission?" Cashtal asked. Salvator glanced at him. "That is what always comes next." On Earth, the absence of a single command structure terrified the Concorde's junior observers. "They have no central authority coordinating these launches," said one, "no unified doctrine." Salvator dismissed the concern. "Fragmented governance is their weakness. Each faction seeks its own expression of defiance. They will exhaust themselves." But Cashtal was no longer entirely convinced. He had spent cycles studying species under pressure. He knew what panic looked like, what bravado looked like, what desperation looked like. This was different. Human ships were not charging the Concorde vessel. They were circling it, mapping it, studying gravitational distortions caused by its mass, measuring energy bleed from its shields, running silent passes at varying distances, adjusting vectors constantly. "They are learning," Cashtal murmured. Salvator turned sharply. "Learning what?" "That remains unclear." The Artemis remained the closest, its commander watching silently. Commander Elena Park stood on her bridge, hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the alien vessel looming outside the viewport. "Any response from Earth?" asked her pilot. "Plenty," Park replied quietly. "No consensus." The pilot snorted softly. "Sounds like us." Park allowed a thin smile. "Open channel to the swarm." The Concorde called it a cloud. Human engineers called it a mess. Neither description captured what it truly was. Every human vessel near the Veiler's Grace was broadcasting continuously, not orders, but data. Raw sensor readings, engine stress metrics, pilot commentary, environmental fluctuations. There was no hierarchy, no flagship, no one giving commands. Instead, ships adjusted their behavior based on what others were experiencing. If one vessel detected a gravitational anomaly, nearby ships altered course slightly. If another encountered radiation spikes, others compensated. It was messy, inefficient, and alarmingly effective. "This is not optimized behavior," said one Concorde tactician. "Their fuel expenditure is excessive." "Yes, but their survivability is increasing," Cashtal replied slowly. Salvayor's crest shifted, a subtle sign of irritation. They are learning nothing of value. Our technology exceeds theirs by centuries. True, Keshtal said, but their adaptability exceeds our projections. Salvayor did not respond. On Earth, something unprecedented unfolded. Nations still argued, but their scientists shared data openly. Military engineers quietly released classified research to civilian networks. Competing corporations suspended patent enforcement. Rival space agencies began joint simulations without formal treaties. No one announced unity. No one declared cooperation. It simply happened, because no one could afford not to. In an underground facility beneath what had once been a divided border, a group of physicists stared at a holographic display. "They're mapping the Concorde's gravity envelope," said Dr. Hassan Malik, his voice tight with awe. "To not penetrate it, to disturb it," finished Dr. Yuki Tanaka. Malik nodded. "They're not thinking in terms of weapons, they're thinking in terms of environment." "Can it work?" someone asked. Malik swallowed. "It shouldn't." That answer did not stop them. It energized them. On the 9th day, Salvayor issued a formal notice. "Human vessels," he transmitted, his voice echoing across the swarm, "you are interfering with sanctioned Concorde operations. Withdraw immediately." There was a delay. Then Commander Park's voice returned, steady as ever. "Respectfully, we're not interfering, we're just exploring." Exploring. The word triggered several Concorde subroutines. Exploring implied curiosity. Curiosity implied uncertainty. Uncertainty implied improbability. Salvayor felt something cold settle behind his eyes. "You are in violation of protected space," he said sharply. Park paused. "Protected from what?" she asked. The question lingered. Salvayor ended the transmission. The human ships began to change behavior. Not dramatically, subtly. Some accelerated briefly, then cut engines. Others deployed mass ballast, ore containers, water tanks, scrap metal, then jettisoned them along precise vectors. "What are they doing?" demanded a Concorde officer. Keshtal stared at the readouts, his voice barely audible. "They're creating microgravitational disturbances." "That's impossible," the officer snapped. "Their ships are too small." "Individually," Keshtal agreed, "yes." The data shifted again. A ripple passed through the Concorde's gravity envelope, barely noticeable, but real. Salvayor felt the deck tremble beneath his feet. "What was that?" he demanded.
"Localized spatial instability," Keshtal said, eyes wide. "Minor, but—" Another tremor followed, and another. The human ships were not attacking. They were stacking effects, creating turbulence where none should exist. "They're using us," Keshtal whispered, "using our mass as an amplifier." The Concorde had never considered such a tactic. Why would they? No rational species would risk destruction on an unproven idea. No rational species would gamble lives on theory and instinct. Salvayor's confidence cracked for the first time. On the Artemis, alarms wailed. "Structural stress at 20%, the engineer called out. "Gravity shear increasing." Park nodded. "Hold course." "Ma'am." "We knew this would hurt," Park said quietly. "That's why it matters." She opened a channel to the swarm. "Adjust vectors," she said. "Phase 2." No one acknowledged. They didn't need to. The swarm shifted. Inside the Veiler's Grace, chaos spread. Stabilizers strained. Navigation systems fought conflicting inputs. The ship's perfect orbit wavered. "This shouldn't be possible," an officer cried. Salvayor gripped the railing. For the first time in his long career, he did not know what came next. The curve had bent, and it was still bending. Outside, the human ships burned hard, hulls groaning, engines screaming, pilots making split-second decisions that no algorithm would ever recommend. They were afraid, they were determined, they were alive, and history was about to turn. The Concorde had prepared for war. They had prepared for rebellion, collapse, negotiation, even martyrdom. What they had never prepared for was improvisation on a civilizational scale. Inside the Veiler's Grace, alarms did not scream and panic. Concorde systems were too disciplined for that. Instead, they issued calm, orderly alerts, each one more disturbing than the last. Stability margin reduced to 92%. Gravitational harmonics deviating. Predictive engine confidence below threshold. Analyst Quiche Tal stared at the cascading warnings, his breathing shallow. High emissary, he said slowly, carefully. Our projections are no longer converging. Sail-Veyor turned toward him. Explain. They are diverging, Quiche Tal said, exponentially. On the tactical display, the human swarm no longer resembled noise. Patterns emerged, but they were temporary, forming and dissolving too quickly for Concorde models to lock onto. It was like watching weather. Not chaos, a system too alive to freeze. Commander Elena Park felt the Artemis shudder violently. "Inertial dampers are at limit," the engineer shouted. Park gripped the rail as gravity shifted beneath her feet. The stars outside the viewport stretched and twisted, light bending in subtle arcs. "Report from the swarm?" she asked. "Mixed," replied her communications officer. "Some ships are pulling back, others are pushing harder." Park nodded. "As expected." She keyed the channel again. "You don't have to stay," she said calmly, her voice broadcast to every nearby vessel. "You don't have to stay." There was no response, but no one left. Across the swarm, human captains made the same choice, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood what was at stake. If this worked, the Concorde would be forced to see them. If it failed, humanity would still have proven something far more important to itself. Sail-Veyor felt it then. Not panic, doubt. His species had evolved beyond fear long ago. Fear required uncertainty about survival. The Concorde always knew how things would end, until now. "What is their casualty tolerance?" Sail-Veyor demanded. Quiche Tal hesitated. "Unknown. Estimate. High. Extremely high." That was wrong. Every species had a threshold, a point at which loss outweighed principle. But humans, they are not optimizing for survival, Quiche Tal continued. They are optimizing for outcome. Sail-Veyor's crest dimmed slightly, a sign of internal distress. "That is irrational," he said. "Yes," Quiche Tal agreed, "but it is effective." The human swarm reached critical mass, not in size, in interaction. Microgravitational distortions overlapped in interfering with one another in unpredictable ways. The Concorde ship's immense mass amplified the effect, its own gravity well becoming a lens that focused the disturbance inward. "This is madness," a Concorde navigator cried. "They're destabilizing the entire local space-time field." Sail-Veyor stared at the display as the Veiler's Grace drifted. Only meters, but meters that should not have existed. "We are losing orbital integrity," Quiche Tal said slowly. "Can we disengage?" Sail-Veyor asked. "Yes," Quiche Tal replied. But it would be a retreat," Sail-Veyor finished. Silence filled the chamber. The Concorde did not retreat. They never had. On the Artemis, a warning light turned red. "Commander," the engineer said, voice shaking, "we're past safe limits. Another surge like that and we could lose the hull." Park closed her eyes briefly. She thought of Earth, of oceans and cities and arguments and music, of a species that had survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and its own worst instincts. She opened her eyes. "Hold," she said. The Artemis surged forward. The gravity storm intensified. Sail-Veyor moved closer to the viewport. For the first time, he stopped looking at projections. He looked directly at the human ships. They were burning fuel inefficiently, overheating systems, pilots correcting by instinct, not calculation. They were not elegant. They were not precise. They were committed. "They know they might die," Salvaor said softly. "Yes," Kishtal replied, "and they came anyway." Salvaor felt something shift deep within his understanding. The Concorde believed survival was the ultimate motivator. Humans believed meaning was. The gravity storm peaked. The Veiler's Grace lurched violently, its stabilizers finally overwhelmed, not destroyed, but forced to compensate so aggressively that the ship's systems temporarily shut down non-essential functions, including projection authority. Across Earth, screens flickered back to normal. For the first time since the Concorde's arrival, humanity was not being watched. The Concorde fleet pulled back, not in disorder, but unmistakably, a controlled withdrawal. Salvaor ordered it himself. "Disengage," he said, "steady. Restore distance." Kishtal stared at him. "High Emissary, this will alter the archive." Salvaor nodded. "It already has." The human swarm did not pursue. As the Concorde fleet retreated, the gravity disturbances faded. One by one, human vessels powered down, drifting, damaged but intact. Cheers erupted across Earth, not victory cries, relief. Commander Park slumped into her chair as the Artemis stabilized. "We did it," someone whispered. Park shook her head. "No," she said quietly, "we showed them." Back aboard the Veiler's Grace, Salvaor stood alone in the observation chamber.
The predictive engines were silent, disabled. For the first time in Concorde history, a civilization had forced them offline, not by destroying them, but by rendering them irrelevant. Keshtal approached hesitantly. "What designation shall we assign humanity now?" he asked. Salvaor considered the question for a long time. Finally, he said, "Unbounded." The word echoed through the archive. Silence followed the Concorde's withdrawal. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that settles after something fundamental has shifted, when no one yet knows what the new shape of reality will be. Above Earth, human ships drifted in battered orbits, hulls scorched, engines strained, crews exhausted beyond anything training had prepared them for. But they were alive, and for the first time since humanity had looked up at the stars and wondered if it was alone, it had not been dismissed. Across the planet, people stared at clear skies. Screens no longer carried alien faces. No commands echoed across every frequency. No invisible pressure weighed on every decision. Children went back outside. Cities breathed. In government chambers, leaders sat in stunned silence, not yet sure how to speak about what had happened. There had been no declaration of war, no formal alliance, no victory parade to plan. Just a moment where humanity had stood its ground, not with overwhelming force, but with stubborn ingenuity and shared risk. Historians would later struggle to define it. Some would call it resistance. Others would call it deterrence. Many would call it luck. But those who had been there knew better. It had been choice. The Artemis limped back toward Earth days later, escorted by ships that had once been strangers. As the planet filled the viewport, Commander Elena Park felt something tighten in her chest. Not pride, relief. "We're being hailed," her communications officer said. Park nodded. "Put it through." The face that appeared on screen was older than Park expected, tired, human in a way that rank could not hide. "You shouldn't have done that," the official said quietly. Park met his gaze. Someone had to. The man studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Yes," he said, "I suppose someone did." Far from Earth, the Concorde fleet regrouped at a safe distance. There were no celebrations, no condemnations, just analysis. Salvator stood before the council chamber, his posture perfectly composed, but those who knew him well could see the subtle dimming of his skin's iridescence. "We withdrew," one counselor said flatly, "from a pre-FTL species." "From a species classified as predictable," said another. Salvator inclined his head. That classification was incorrect. A murmur rippled through the chamber. "Explain," demanded the elder counselor. Salvator activated a projection, not of battle data, but of human communications during the crisis. Laughter under stress, arguments mid-maneuver, pilots singing to steady their hands, scientists screaming contradictory advice, all of it shared openly. "They did not follow a plan," Salvator said. "They followed each other." "That is inefficient," the elder counselor replied. "Yes," Salvator agreed, "and therefore adaptable." He paused. "Our models assume that intelligence seeks stability. Humans seek possibility." The chamber fell silent. Kashtal stepped forward hesitantly. "High Emissary," he said, "if they cannot be predicted, how do we proceed?" Salvator considered the question carefully. "For the first time," he said, "we proceed without assumptions." A radical statement. Dangerous. Necessary. Weeks passed. Humanity rebuilt quietly. Repairs were made. Stories were told. Arguments resumed, because of course they did. Then a message arrived. Not broadcast, directed. A single transmission delivered simultaneously to Earth's major population centers. Salvator appeared on screen, not towering, not enhanced, simply present. "People of Earth," he said, "the Concord acknowledges an error." Gasps echoed across the planet. "We believed you would behave as others have. You did not." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We request dialogue, not integration, not compliance, dialogue." On Earth, millions held their breath. Salvator inclined his head. "As equals." The meeting took place in neutral space. No warships, no weapons charged. Commander Park stood alone in the chamber, not because Earth had no one else to send, but because she had been there when the future bent. Salvator regarded her with something like respect. "You acted without certainty," he said. Park shrugged slightly. "That's kind of our thing." Salvator studied her. "Why risk extinction?" Park thought for a moment. "Because living without choice isn't survival. It's just existing." The words struck deeper than any weapon. News traveled fast. Other civilizations watched in disbelief as the Concord revised its doctrines. Predictive engines were not dismantled, but they were no longer absolute. Humanity introduced a new variable into galactic understanding: volitional chaos. A species that could not be reduced to curves, that accepted inefficiency in exchange for flexibility, that would sacrifice comfort, safety, even lives, not for conquest, but for agency. Where others optimized, humans adapted. Where others calculated risk, humans embraced uncertainty. Among the stars, a new story began to circulate, not as propaganda, as warning. It said, "Beware the species that argues while it works. Beware the species that plans poorly, but commits fully. Beware the species that does not ask, 'Will this work?' but instead asks, 'What happens if we try?'" Years later, long after treaties were signed and new stars mapped together, Elena Park would be asked if she'd been afraid that day. She would smile faintly. "Of course," she'd say, "I was human." Then she'd look up, toward a sky no longer silent. "But fear never stopped us from moving forward," she'd add. It just reminded us why we had to. The galaxy believed that strength was control, that intelligence was foresight, that survival meant knowing the future. Humanity taught it something else. That sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is a species willing to step into the unknown together, unpredictable, imperfect, and unafraid to change history. And for the first time, the galaxy understood what it truly meant to be human. If this story moved you, subscribe for more human stories from the stars.